Thank you very much for the opportunity to share some reflections and to be part of this really important conversation on such an auspicious day for all of us on the continent. I don't have a lot of time and want to cover quite a bit of ground, so I'll just dive straight in. And since we're slightly ahead, if there's questions at the end, I'm very happy to address those. So starting with Agenda 2063, one of the things I find particularly striking is this quote. It is rooted in Pan-Africanism and African Renaissance, and therefore provides a robust framework for addressing past injustices and the realization of the 21st century as the African century. And I find this particularly striking because one of the sensibilities that runs through Agenda 2063 is this attempt to confront our past, our violent past, our complicated past, our painful past, but at the same time to also look towards the future. And in that double act, there's something about a sensibility that is being called for by Agenda 2063, which I find the most interesting thing, as opposed to the various specific goals and aspirations and so on. And I'll return to this down the line. Another quote from Agenda 2063 to kick us off. We aspire that by 2063, and I know a lot of people kind of often wonder about that date. And of course, what it signals is a century after post-colonial independence, right? And so what are we able to achieve within a century as a continent? Africa shall be a prosperous continent with the means and resources to drive its own development, and where, significant for my talk today, cities and other settlements are hubs of cultural and economic activities with modernized infrastructure, and people have access to all the basic necessities of life, including shelter, water, sanitation, energy, public transport, and ICT. And economies are structurally transformed to create shared growth, decent jobs, and economic opportunities for all. Now, keep that in mind as we just spend the next 5 minutes or so familiarizing ourselves with what is the scope and the dynamics of urbanization on the continent. Now, firstly, to locate Africa within the global context, Africa is the least urbanized region of the world, at the moment at 43 to 44%, but it is the region with the fastest rate of urbanization. And what this translates into is that over the next 30 years, between 2020 and 2050, 2 world regions will account for 95% of all urban growth. So as you can see, in this 100-year trend line graph, almost all world regions, except for Latin America, have pretty much completed both their demographic and their urban transitions. And so we won't see a lot more additional population or a much higher rate or number of people living in urban areas. Of course, Asia is a lot more populous than Africa, but in terms of numbers and in proportion, Africa will more than double its urban population in the next 30 years. Now, this is not a singular story, and of course we often repeat and invoke the trope that Africa is not a country, and Africa is certainly not a region. So if we differentiate between these 5 regions on the continent, what we notice is very 2 divergent trends. On the one hand, you have the purple bar and the yellow bars. You will see that there's not that much additional urban growth over the next 30 years. However, in West Africa, there will be a dramatic expansion of the urban population, and so in Central and East Africa. And part of the reason for that is that that is urban growth off a relatively low base. In East Africa, for example, only about 22% of the population is currently urbanized. Now, this is important for us because it means that we've got to really pay attention to the different drivers of urbanization, but also the different forms of urbanization. So if you particularly look at West Africa, you've got this really intricate, complex and dense belt of urban conurbations that stretch all the way from Abidjan across other West African countries onto Kinshasa in DRC. Now, development economists will tell us that urbanization is good for development because it's often associated with higher incomes, better educational outcomes, and importantly, economic productivity. They'll also tell us that having a large youthful population is fantastic because it adds energy and potentially productivity to the labor force. Africa's got both of these things that are converging, if you will. However, at the moment, contrary to what development studies tells us, it is unclear whether these two trends are indeed going to be a boon for Africa or possibly a curse. Now, to just appreciate the significance of that, it's maybe useful to very quickly point out that Africa's by far got the youngest median age of all world regions. And if you project forward to the end of the century, as you will see, at that point, it will still have a significantly younger median age. But more importantly, it also means that we are going to have probably more than half of the global youth population aged between 15 and 34 in 2050 will be in Africa. And so this is really an incredible opportunity. But the question is, in the context of a services and knowledge-driven economy, is whether we can educate this potential resource. And the data at the moment is not particularly optimistic. So what you can see from this graph is that less than 10% of Africa's youth are enrolled in tertiary education. And so this, of course, is something as a university we've got to pay particular attention to, but also really try and understand how we're going to shift the needle on this, particularly as Africa is coming into its full demographic potential at the moment that the global economy has pivoted towards a knowledge platform reinforced by digital infrastructures, and that a lot of value add and productivity in the global economy will be driven by these dimensions, which implies skills, knowledge, and levels of training that at the moment is not available to a large proportion of the population. Now, from an urban perspective, what we try and understand is how these different challenges intersect in space. So the starting point, I would argue very strongly, in this very complicated and expansive conversation across 17 SDGs and a whole number of targets within Agenda 2063, and in some ways to almost keep us honest, is this question of work. And so what we see at the moment is that with our large and growing youthful population, most of them have almost no prospect of accessing a formal job, let alone a decent job. So by far, what is available is precarious employment with very low and variable incomes, and typically outside of South Africa and some North African countries, almost no social protection at all. And of course, what this means at a household level is that households are characterized by the same dynamics. And the point that is relevant for us is that formal living in our suburban imagination is just not an option for the vast majority of people. So people are confined to slum living conditions in one form or another, and that is really the only hustle that is available to the majority of people. So what we see is that low wages intersects with health outcomes, with the climate emergency, with intensifying economic shocks. And we see the production of a kind of normalization of large-scale societal injustice. And so that should point us in the direction of probably particularly goals 5 and 10, dealing with gender inequality and societal inequality. And so if we can think the question of jobs in relation to the question of inequality, I would suggest that that's maybe one way of helping orient how we will reinforce our research agendas. Now, this is a systemic question. It's a long-standing challenge that we face. And so this graph is just a stark reminder of the mountain we've got to climb. So 22 of the 25 poorest countries in terms of GDP per capita are in Africa. That means that half, almost half, of African countries fall into this classification. And the question is, what's the prospects, of course, of shifting this? Now, if we take a longitudinal view of Africa's share, and by this metric is GDP purchasing power parity in numbers, you will see that over the last 40 years, Africa's contribution in terms of the global share of the global economy has essentially flatlined. And so what we see is urbanization happening. We are seeing a significant demographic expansion, but it is within a context where the economy is basically not growing enough, and where it is growing, that inequality is hampering the distributional effects of that. And so we've got to ask some serious questions about what the levers might be to shift things in this context. Now, of course, as an urbanist, what is relevant within this very, very aggregate picture is the fact that cities have a very particular contribution and place within the global economy. It is 80% of global GDP, but also it is responsible for 75% of greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, outside of Africa, more than 50% of populations live there, and we know this number will be almost 2/3 by 2050. This graph, which I'm sure most of you won't read, it just summarizes the fact that 29 mega regions captures 65% of the global economy. And as you can see, except for Cairo, or the conurbation between Cairo and Tel Aviv, Africa is predictably not on the map. It falls off the map effectively. And so this again brings us back to the question, in this context of dramatic economic change in terms of the fundamental drivers of value add in the global economy, within a context of climate pressures and all of the regulatory effects that will engender, is how are we going to think about economic incorporation within this framework, and what is the role of our youthful population and the urban transition to think through that. Now, to answer that question, we've got to be pretty precise and clear about the challenges that we face. And there is a very large and complex set of issues with regard to what is reproducing this particular form of urban development in Africa. But I want to just highlight three for now. And this generally applies to a great extent outside of South Africa, but I would argue that it certainly has relevance in the South African context as well. The first challenge we have is that most urban investments and most urban planning that government is able to exercise tends to cater for a relatively small middle class and formal business sector. And this sucks out almost all of the resources from the available fiscus. And we then see the effect of that is this spatial bifurcation that is in evidence in most African cities. Now, what happens is that the flip side of that is, of course, that people have to fend for themselves through various kinds of informal livelihood practices, both to access basic services, but also to access some form of income and economic activity. The challenge we face is that this is seen as something that should be policed. And there is this criminalization or extortion of informal livelihood practices. And this is, again, a general trend, and a lot of research we've done with WeGo, which is a global network looking at informal workers, underscores the fact that people are not just precarious, but they are also vulnerable to routine extortion. And finally, the lack of basic services, of course, and public infrastructure and social development opportunities means that all of this potential that sits embedded within this youthful demographic is probably being squandered. But it is not just about this model. We, of course, have to understand its longitudinal roots. And again, this is a much more complicated story, but for the sake of just filling out the analysis, is we've got to recognize just the extent to which our colonial era model of urban investment has found an extension into the post-colonial period. And so what we've seen after 1960 is that there's been this long-term pattern of underinvestment in both new infrastructure, in extending existing infrastructure, and of course in maintenance. And this has meant that as urban areas are growing, it is often characterized by this lack of access to basic services. But what this also then affects is a kind of institutional and technological path dependency and lock-in. So yes, we've got Agenda 2063, yes, we've got all of the goals around the SDGs, but how we shift institutionally and in terms of the political economy underpinnings of the current system are some of the questions that we, one, are not asking clearly enough, and secondly, we're very short on evidence on how to think through that. And so what we've got to do as a starting point is to recognize what is the de facto situation. And this is that you've got these cities teeming with these organic, entangled and hybrid systems of infrastructural functioning. And this affords some access to some possibility of a better quality of life. But generally, it represents a major cost to the livelihoods and the well-being of urban majorities. And what is particularly intractable is that it reinforces spatial inequalities in terms of housing, education, health, jobs, recreation, and various opportunities associated with urbanism. And so the issue is not just saying let's have more investment in education or in health, but is recognizing that that investment is going into a context where there's a spatial dynamic that makes quality access and outcomes very difficult to achieve. Now, what does Agenda 2063 say about all of this? And I don't have time now to elaborate on how we think about these policy frameworks as artifacts that can help us reframe attention as opposed to things to be taken literally, but happy to come back to that if there's questions. So for me, thinking about Agenda 2063 as kind of a political, social artifact, the two things that strike me about it that is really potentially powerful for a societal conversation is this emphasis on Indigenous knowledge systems and how we need to combine Indigenous knowledge systems with the potentialities of the knowledge economy. What this translates to in practical policy, focusing and or sort of zooming in on this jobs crisis question, is the potential to see green industrialization as the mechanism to pursue what Agenda 2063 calls structural transformation. What structural transformation refers to is the fact that we've hardly been able to expand the industrial basis of African economies since the 1960s. The relative proportions of the service economy, agriculture, and manufacturing has remained stable over the last 60 years. And we've got to shift that if we are going to produce job-rich growth. What the SDGs, of course, foreground for me that is different to the Millennium Development Goals are these three emphases. An explicit focus on inequality, which we've never seen in the global economy. And our first keynote, of course, elaborated a little bit on how that came about and why that's significant. The question of environmental limits, absolute limits to the growth model we have. And link then this need to transform the global capitalist system, so that we can have more sustainable production and consumption patterns via industrial innovation, Goal 8. And the mechanism for that, of course, in this frame is the adoption of circular economy principles. Now, if we bring these two things together, it points me in the direction of something called Indigenous innovation. And here, Indigenous knowledge is not just what we traditionally associate with people's knowledge of the land, of soils, of crops, and so forth, but it is in fact the innate intelligence and the innate knowledge that the Vice Chancellor referred to in her opening reflections that we need to understand better, and why co-production and transdisciplinary methods is necessary. And it's about how we take the ingenuity that is embedding in those survival practices and combine that with new ways of doing things based on technological possibilities. And we see examples of this all over the continent already. My suggestion is that this is what's got to orient us. And this can fit very neatly within the policy frame that flows from Agenda 2063. So what Agenda 2063 sort of tells us at the macro level, in terms of national policies, macroeconomic framework policies, national development policies, these four imperatives need to be squared if we are going to drive structural transformation. The infrastructure deficit, and as you know, 65% or 55% of Africans don't have access to electricity, the growth imperative, the employment imperative, and the sustainability questions. And this will give us the uniquely African set of frameworks My suggestion is that that's got to be spatially anchored. And where we can anchor that, of course, in city regions, which includes the catchments of rural economies and the interfaces that live there. But how does this question of structural transformation in Africa square with the SDGs and sort of where I started off with urbanization? So in my reading of the 17 goals, our entry point as a global conversation, and certainly as an African conversation as well, has to, of course, be the societal transformation question, this cultural question of what is termed responsible consumption and production. This idea that we've got to upend the extractive model of capitalism. The way to do that, and where we come in as the repositories of knowledge and innovation in society, is through Goal 9, that talks about the need for new kinds of industry, new kinds of infrastructure, and so on. For me, the driver of that is the fact that we've still got to build the cities and town for 2/3 of our population over the next 30 years, right? And just think of that, what we've done in the last 60 years, and how little we've been able to achieve, and how we've got to deal with that backlog and a doubling of the population in the next 30 years. But here's all these tools potentially, and we can then achieve these higher order goals. However, to get that right, we've got to understand that it is the 3 environmental goals that has got to set the design parameters for what sustainable cities and communities would be. And I would argue that that gives us the template, if you will, to just substantiate what decent work and economic growth is. And let's face it, right, within the SDGs, the contradictions around the neoliberal global economy and the normative imperatives that sit in a lot of the material outcomes goals is not explicitly addressed. And so we've got to substantiate a model that can be post-neoliberalism for what decent work and economic growth would be. And that, of course, is all about enabling through decent work, the achievement of material empowerment. So these are all the goals that relate to basic services, if you will, and access to health. And there's a dialectic between that and political empowerment. So gender equality, reduced inequality, peace, justice, and so on. And so this might be a way of thinking strategically in a grounded way about our imperatives in Africa that sits within Agenda 2063 in relation to the larger framework. For us within the urban field specifically, there's a whole set of chunks of big innovation questions that we don't have answers for, and that we don't at the moment. The current science system and the innovation systems don't work or support or enable us to work on these questions in a co-producing transdisciplinary way. But let me just very quickly list them for the sake of interest. And this is this big question of where's the money going to go into if we are able to deal with the infrastructure gap? And what do we mean by sustainable infrastructure? There's the question of green buildings and how we retrofit the stock we have. Those 2 things cannot happen without deep and profound regulatory reform, but we don't know what that reform is if we don't have a new paradigm for property and how property and ecosystem service have to be thought together. These are big philosophical, social science, social theory questions, which we're only just beginning to explore, and I would argue are more generative ways of getting into the bigger debates about decoloniality. And then, of course, none of those things you create an opportunity frame for it unless there's profound political economy change. And these only come about through radical citywide coalition around these new questions, whether it's gentrification, whether it's climate justice, and so on. And of course, the big question is, what difference will the digital disruptive technologies make? How do we think about that? Not as mechanisms for further in digital inequality, but for catalyzing new ways of thinking about these operations. We've been thinking through what the criteria might be to take us in this direction. And again, of course, it's got to confront the carbon question, it's got to confront the employment question, it's got to think about circularity, about interning value within communities. It's got to be appreciative of the potential of digital enablement, but very importantly, it's got to be both spatially efficient and just. And very little of the investments that is currently being made and that we can track achieves those kinds of outcomes. But the point about this is that we can draw a connection between Agenda 2063, the SDGs, the frame that I've just presented, and then the kind of analytical criteria we can establish to assess whether we are in fact making progress or not. However, institutionally, we've got to reinvent ourselves, I would argue fairly strongly. We've got to reinvent the system that finance what we do, and we've got to understand that unless there are mechanisms that put us on an equal footing in relation to other societal actors, again, as the Vice-Chancellor intimated in the beginning, we're not going to get there. And so one quote from colleagues about what experimentation might mean might be pointed and helpful. And they just argue that we define an experiment in the context of sustainability transitions as an inclusive, practice-based and change-led initiative designed to promote system innovation through social learning under conditions of deep uncertainty and ambiguity. The notion of system innovation in this definition refers to co-evolutionary processes of far-reaching changes in technological, institutional, infrastructural, and social dimensions of a system. And what strikes me in reading this is just the profound interdisciplinary nature of our inquiries in the future. And if we look at the kind of metrics we were just looking at in the previous talk, how difficult it is going to be to shift our disciplinary sectoral approaches and everything that reinforces that onto an institutional model that can enable us to establish what I call city-level innovation capacity. And that's capacity that is not just able to do foundational research, not just able to do action research, terms we're very familiar with, but can really begin to blend that with three other kinds of research activity. Translational research, which is very much where we take today's conversation and embed that in ongoing systemic monitoring processes. The importance of experimentation and prototyping to look at all of these potentialities, applying the criteria to say what would a sanitation system look like if we apply those criteria? What would an integrated public transport look like if we take minibus taxis and border seriously and try and transition them onto electric engines? And of course, finally, this question of societal intermediation through knowledge intermediation, where we curate these processes of co-production. These are skills we're not trained to do at the moment. These are not things the university is able to support at the moment because of how the larger funding system works. So, but I want to just point to with this is that we have a sense of what this all might mean. The work that lies ahead are enormous, but we've got to recognize what the stakes are. And I want to conclude then with this very powerful indictment of African leaders and African institutions, mainstream institutions like ourselves, by a collective of African intellectuals who penned an open letter at the onset of COVID-19 a year ago. And they argue that the challenge for Africa is no less than the restoration of its intellectual freedom and capacity to create, without which no sovereignty is conceivable. It is to break with the outsourcing of our sovereign prerogatives, to reconnect with local configurations, to break with sterile imitation, to adapt science, technology, and research to our context, to elaborate institutions such as city-level innovation or experimentation labs on the basis of our specificities and our resources, to adopt an inclusive governance framework and endogenous development to create value in Africa in order to reduce our systemic dependence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edgar. That was really a great presentation and lots of food for thought. I see that there are some questions coming through and we have a minute or two to work with. So I think we'll go on to the questions of others and we won't start with. You spoke about urban growth and the pressure whether this will be a limiting factor to urban growth or whether the lack of infrastructure will simply further entrench poverty and inequality. Would you like to address that?
Sorry, so you, I don't know if it's my bandwidth or yours, but I missed the first bit of it. Can you quickly repeat it?
I'm going to go again. Urban growth will add significant pressure to physical infrastructure, or lack of infrastructure could entrench poverty and inequality. How do you see this?
Yeah, so the exact same thing happened, but it's fine. I think I got the gist of the question. I guess that's what we live with online conversations. So the lack of infrastructure. So the interesting thing about this is that people sort of invest in and create what we call makeshift infrastructures, right? So the lack of infrastructure is not going to stop urban growth, in part because in most parts of the continent now, most urban growth is population growth within cities already. It's only in the sort of the bottom half of the least developed countries where we see urban growth as the result predominantly from rural to urban migration. So that's important too. So we're not going to have a tapering off of urban growth anytime soon. Secondly, some of the research is showing that even with a significant increase in educational opportunities for girls and for young women since the MDG goals, we are still not seeing the level of fertility drop off that would be expected with the changing levels of educational attainment. So we can continue to expect fairly significant population growth for the short to medium term. And thirdly, because people are as inventive as I said, the lack of sufficient infrastructure is not a prohibitor for people to urbanize or to try and seek a livelihood in cities. So what we are going to see is an increase in the sort of sophistication of makeshift solutions. So one example, it would be the fact that in East Africa, the majority of people get around on these small scooters, and through a pretty much largely informal system, they've been able to adapt that infrastructure, which is not financed by the state at all, onto an Uber-like platform. And what this has done is it's grown the service, it's reduced traffic accidents, and it's increased the incomes of both the boda drivers and the owners of the vehicles and so on. So I expect we are going to see similar kinds of dynamics in various infrastructure sectors, including off-grid renewable energy instruments. And so it's going to be a very dynamic space. I hope that answered the question, Sue. I'm not sure I fully understood it. Yeah, thanks.